In the final issue of the Invincible comic, issue 144, there is a moment that most people gloss over. Nolan Grayson is old. Not old by Viltrumite standards, where centuries pass like long afternoons, but old in the way that matters. Tired in his bones, slow in his thoughts, and he is sitting with his son, not flying, not fighting, not conquering anything at all, just sitting. And he says something that reframes everything you thought you understood about him. He tells Mark that he is proud of him. Not proud in the way a Viltrumite is supposed to be proud. Not proud of strength or conquest or the continuation of empire. Proud the way a father is proud when his son turns out to be a better person than he was. That moment, quiet as it is, represents one of the most complete philosophical transformations in the history of comics. Because Nolan Grayson did not simply become a better person. He became a different kind of being entirely, and the distance between who he was and who he became maps almost perfectly onto a warning that Friedrich Nietzsche issued in the 1880s. A warning about what happens when powerful beings mistake domination for greatness. That is what this video is about. Not just Omni Man as a character, though we will spend a great deal of time with him tonight. Not just Nietzsche as a philosopher, though his ideas will be woven through every section of what follows. This is about the space between those two things, the gap between what Nietzsche actually meant and what the world did with his ideas. Because that gap, that misunderstanding, that dangerous misreading of the Übermensch concept, is the entire engine that drives Nolan Grayson's story from its first page to its last. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of deep dive, subscribing to the channel is completely free and it genuinely helps us keep making these long videos for you. That is all, just a quiet ask before we settle in for the long haul tonight. So let us start where Nietzsche started. Not with the Übermensch, not with the will to power, not with any of the ideas that have been stamped onto t-shirts and tattooed onto the arms of people who have never read a word he wrote. Let us start with a funeral, specifically the funeral of God. In 1882, Nietzsche published a book called The Gay Science, and in it he included a passage that has become one of the most quoted and least understood sentences in the history of philosophy. God is dead, he wrote, and we have killed him. Now, most people hear that and think Nietzsche was celebrating. They think he was an atheist throwing a party, glad to be rid of the old man in the sky. But that is not what is happening in that passage at all. If you actually read it, you will find that the character who says those words, a madman running through a marketplace with a lantern, is terrified. He is not celebrating the death of God. He is mourning it. He is panicking because he understands something that the people around him do not. He understands that when you remove the foundation that an entire civilization has built its morality upon, you don't simply get freedom. You get a void, an enormous, terrifying, bottomless void, and something is going to fill it. That is the setup. That is where everything begins, not with triumph, but with dread. Nietzsche saw that European civilization was moving away from religious foundations, and he was not happy about it or sad about it in any simple way. He was afraid of what would come next. Because if God is dead, if there is no cosmic judge, no eternal reward, no divine plan, then every moral system that was built on those assumptions collapses. And the question becomes, what do you build in its place? Now, hold that thought. Keep it somewhere close because we are going to need it. But first, we need to understand something about Nietzsche himself. Because the man behind the ideas is just as important as the ideas themselves, and his life story contains a kind of irony that will become essential as we move deeper into this analysis. Friedrich Nietzsche was not a strong man. He was not a warrior or a conqueror, or anything remotely resembling the popular image of the philosopher who celebrated strength. He was sickly, chronically, debilitatingly sickly. He suffered from migraines so severe that they would leave him bedridden for days. His eyesight was failing. His stomach gave him constant trouble. He spent much of his adult life in rented rooms in quiet towns in Switzerland and Italy, writing through the pain, pausing when the headaches became too much, then returning to his desk when they subsided enough for him to see the page. This matters because it tells you something crucial about what Nietzsche meant by strength. He was not talking about physical power. He could not have been. He had almost none. When he wrote about overcoming, about the will to power, about the Übermensch who transcends human limitations, he was writing from the perspective of a man who could barely get through the day without his body betraying him. His version of strength was not the ability to punch through a wall. It was the ability to keep creating, keep thinking, keep affirming life even when your body is a prison and your pain is constant and the world has given you every reason to give up. Think about that the next time you picture the Übermensch. Not a muscled god flying through the sky. A thin, mustachioed, half-blind professor sitting in a cold room in Sils Maria, writing sentences that would change the course of Western thought while his head throbs and his eyes water and his stomach churns. That is what overcoming looks like in its authentic form. Not dominance, persistence. Not power over others. Power over yourself. Over your own weakness, your own despair, your own very reasonable desire to just stop trying and lie down and let the darkness take you. The Viltrumites would look at the real Nietzsche and see everything they despise. A weak body, a fragile constitution, a man who could not survive the first round of their great purge. And they would be completely, catastrophically wrong about him. Because the man who wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra while barely able to stand contained, more genuine strength, more authentic will to power, more of what the Übermensch actually represents than the entire Viltrum Empire combined. He just did not express it by hitting things. And this is the first clue that the Viltrumite version of Nietzsche's philosophy is a fraud. Because if you read Nietzsche and come away thinking that strength means physical dominance, you have not read Nietzsche. You have read a press release about Nietzsche, written by someone who wanted to sell a product. The product being, conveniently, whatever form of power the reader already possessed. Now let us talk about the Viltrumites. The Viltrum Empire, as it is presented in both the comics and the animated series, is a civilization that has already answered Nietzsche's question. They answered it a long time ago, and they answered it in the worst possible way. The Viltrumites looked at the universe and saw no God, no cosmic order, no moral law written into the fabric of reality. And instead of grappling with that void, instead of sitting with the terror of it the way Nietzsche's madman does, they simply filled it with themselves. They became the gods, they became the cosmic order, they became the moral law. The strong survive, the weak are conquered or destroyed. The universe belongs to whoever can take it. That is not philosophy. That is not a moral system. That is what happens when you skip the hard part of Nietzsche's argument and jump straight to the conclusion you wanted to reach anyway. And this is crucial. This is the thing that separates a careful reading of Nietzsche from the cartoon version that has been floating around for over a century. Nietzsche did not say that the strong should dominate the weak. He never said that. What he said was that the death of God created a crisis, and that crisis required a new kind of human being to resolve it. He called that new kind of human being the Übermensch, the Overman. And the Overman was not a conqueror. The Overman was a creator, someone who could look into the void where God used to be and, instead of filling it with brute force, fill it with meaning, self-created meaning, values that were chosen, not inherited, a life that was affirmed, not endured. The Viltrumites are not the Übermensch. They are what Nietzsche was afraid would show up instead. They are the misreading made flesh. They are what happens when you take the idea of transcending human limitations and strip away everything that made it beautiful, leaving only the power, only the dominance, only the cold mathematics of who can hit harder and live longer. But before we get to Nolan, let us linger a moment longer on the Viltrumites as a civilization, because there is something happening beneath the surface of their culture that is worth examining more closely. The Viltrumites do not just practice domination, they worship it. They have built an entire cosmology around the idea that the strong deserve to rule, and they enforce that cosmology with the same totalitarian rigor that any religious fundamentalism enforces its dogma. There are no Viltrumite atheists, so to speak. No Viltrumite skeptics. No Viltrumites sitting around in coffee shops debating whether the Great Purge was actually a good idea. The ideology is total. The conformity is absolute, and anyone who deviates is either corrected or destroyed. Nietzsche had a term for this kind of system. He called it the herd, and the herd in Nietzsche's philosophy is not defined by weakness. It is defined by uniformity. The herd is any group of beings who have surrendered their individual capacity for thought and value creation in exchange for the comfort of belonging. The herd says, we all believe the same thing, and we punish anyone who does not. The herd mistakes agreement for truth. The herd mistakes conformity for strength. And the herd, regardless of how powerful its individual members might be, is philosophically dead, because it has stopped asking questions, and a being that has stopped asking questions has stopped being fully alive. The Viltrumites are the most powerful herd in the universe, and they do not know it. They think they are individuals because each of them is individually strong, but individual physical strength is not the same as individual thought. You can bench press a planet and still be a sheep. You can fly through the vacuum of space and still be following a path that someone else laid out for you. The Viltrumites fly very fast and very far, and they never go anywhere they have not already been. That is the tragedy of their civilization, and it is a tragedy that Nietzsche would have recognized instantly. And this brings us to the specific Viltrumite who concerns us most tonight. Think about who Omni Man is at the beginning of the story. Think about what he represents. He arrives on Earth and he performs the role of a superhero. He saves people, he smiles for cameras, he joins the Guardians of the Globe, he marries a human woman, Debbie Grayson, and has a half-human son, Mark. And from the outside, from the perspective of everyone on Earth, he looks like the ultimate good guy, the most powerful being on the planet, using his power to help. But here is the thing, none of it is real. None of it means anything to him. He is not helping because he believes in the value of human life. He is not a hero because he has chosen to be good. He is performing. He is going through the motions of heroism the way an actor performs a role on stage, with technical precision and no inner life. Every rescue, every battle, every moment of apparent selflessness is part of a mission. Weaken the planet's defenses, gain their trust, prepare them for conquest. And this maps onto something Nietzsche wrote about with enormous precision. Nietzsche distinguished between what he called master morality and slave morality. And the distinction is not what most people think it is. Master morality in Nietzsche's framework is the morality of those who define values for themselves. They do not look to others for approval. They do not measure their worth against external standards. They create their own meaning and live by it. Slave morality, by contrast, is reactive. It defines itself in opposition to the master. The slave says, "They are evil, and therefore I am good." It is a morality born out of resentment, out of weakness, out of the need to make your suffering feel meaningful by casting your oppressor as a villain. Now, at first glance, the Viltrumites look like they embody master morality. They define their own values, they do not care what lesser beings think of them, they measure worth by strength and capability, not by the approval of others. But look closer. Look at how the Viltrum Empire actually functions. It is not a civilization of individuals creating their own meaning. It is a civilization of conformity enforced by violence. The Great Purge, the event in Viltrumite history where they killed the weakest half of their own population, was not an act of creation. It was an act of destruction. It was not about building something new. It was about eliminating anything that did not fit a predetermined standard. That is not master morality. That is slave morality wearing a mask. It is a system that defines itself by what it destroys, rather than what it creates. The Viltrumites do not create values. They enforce a single value, strength, and they punish anyone who deviates from it. That is the most rigid, the most suffocating, the most intellectually bankrupt form of conformity imaginable. It just happens to be enforced by beings who can bench press mountains. And Nolan, at the beginning of his story, does not see this. He cannot see it. He has spent centuries inside the Viltrumite framework, and the framework is all he knows. He believes, genuinely believes, that the Viltrumite way is the natural order of things. The strong conquer, the weak submit. The universe sorts itself out through power. To him, this is not cruelty. It is simply how things are. It is as natural and unremarkable as gravity. This is what makes the early scenes of Invincible so unsettling when you revisit them with full knowledge of what Nolan is. Every warm moment with Debbie, every proud look at Mark, every casual conversation over dinner, all of it is happening inside the mind of someone who views the people around him as fundamentally beneath him. Not out of malice necessarily, not out of hatred, out of something worse. Indifference dressed up as benevolence, the way you might be kind to a pet you are fond of, knowing full well that its lifespan is a fraction of yours, and its inner world is something you will never truly understand or need to. And this is the first major Nietzschean theme we need to sit with tonight. The idea of beyond good and evil. Nietzsche wrote a book with that title, published in 1886, and the central argument is that traditional moral categories, good and evil, right and wrong, are not universal truths. They are human constructions. They are stories we tell ourselves to make sense of a world that does not come pre-equipped with meaning. And for most of human history, those stories were anchored in religion. God said this is good and this is evil, and that was that. But once God is dead, once that anchor is pulled up, the categories start to drift. Good and evil become negotiable. They become a matter of perspective. Omni Man, as a Viltrumite, lives beyond good and evil not because he has thought deeply about morality and arrived at some transcendent understanding, but because he was never inside those categories to begin with. He does not reject human morality. He simply does not recognize it as applicable to him. It would be like expecting a human to feel guilt about stepping on an ant. The moral framework does not extend that far. The categories do not apply. And here is where it gets genuinely disturbing. Because Nietzsche's point was not that living beyond good and evil is automatically better. His point was that it is dangerous. incredibly catastrophically dangerous. Because when you remove moral categories, when you step outside the framework that tells you what is right and what is wrong, you had better replace it with something meaningful, something life-affirming, something creative. Otherwise, what you get is not the Overman. What you get is the monster. There is a scene early in the animated series that is easy to overlook on first viewing, but becomes haunting once you understand the full picture. Nolan is in the backyard with Mark teaching him to fly, and his face, the way J.K. Simmons voices it, carries something that is hard to name. It is not fake. That is the unsettling thing. The pride, the encouragement, the warmth, none of it sounds performed, and that creates a philosophical problem that Nietzsche would have found fascinating. What happens when a performance becomes indistinguishable from the real thing? At what point does pretending to be a good father become being a good father? Is there a meaningful difference between love that was chosen and love that crept in while you were pretending? Nietzsche wrote extensively about authenticity, about what it means for an action or a feeling to be real. And one of his most radical claims was that the distinction between authentic and performed is not as clean as we would like it to be. We are all performing to some degree. We perform our social roles, our professional identities, our cultural expectations. And sometimes, if we perform long enough and with enough commitment, the performance transforms into something genuine. The mask grows roots. The role becomes the self. This is not hypocrisy. It is how human beings actually work. We do not discover who we are and then act accordingly. We act, and through acting, we discover. Nolan did not come to Earth intending to become a father. He came intending to conquer. But the act of fathering, the daily accumulation of moments, the bedtime stories and the baseball games and the quiet mornings and the 1,000 tiny gestures that make up a life with a child, did something to him that all the Viltrumite conditioning in the universe could not prevent. It made him care, not because he decided to care, because caring is what happens when you are present for someone else's life, day after day, year after year, even if your original reasons for being there had nothing to do with them. This is what makes the early Invincible episodes so much more complex than they appear. On the surface, it is a story about a superhero and his son. Beneath the surface, it is a story about a being who is being slowly, imperceptibly transformed by the very life he was sent to exploit. And that transformation is happening at a level so deep that even Nolan himself does not fully understand it until it is too late to reverse. But that is not even the strangest part of Nolan's story, because the really interesting philosophical question is not about the beginning. It is about what happens to him on Earth. What happens to a being who exists beyond good and evil when he accidentally stumbles into something that looks a lot like love? Let us talk about Debbie Grayson for a moment. Not because she is a central figure in Nietzsche's philosophy, obviously, but because she represents something that Nietzsche wrote about extensively and that the Viltrumite Empire has no framework for understanding. She represents the power of what Nietzsche called lived experience, the kind of meaning that cannot be imposed from above, but can only be discovered through genuine engagement with life. When Nolan first arrives on Earth and begins his relationship with Debbie, it is part of the mission. She is a means to an end, a way to blend in, to appear human, to create the appearance of a life while he does the real work of preparing Earth for Viltrumite conquest. But something happens. Something that the Viltrum Empire, with all its power and all its centuries of rigid ideology, never prepared him for. He starts to actually feel something. Not immediately, not dramatically, slowly. The way rust forms on iron, the way water shapes stone. Day by day, year by year, the performance starts to become less of a performance and more of a life. This is philosophically fascinating because it mirrors one of Nietzsche's most important but least discussed ideas. Nietzsche believed that authentic transformation does not happen through force of will alone. It happens through experience, through living, through being in the world and allowing the world to change you. He called this process of self-overcoming Selbstüberwindung, and it was central to his vision of the Overman. The Overman is not someone who arrives fully formed. The Overman is someone who becomes, who transforms, who goes through the fire of lived experience and comes out the other side as something new. Nolan does not know this is happening to him. That is the crucial part. He does not sit down one day and decide to start caring about Debbie or about Mark or about Earth. It creeps in. It seeps through the cracks in his Viltrumite armor. And by the time he realizes what has happened, by the time he understands that he has accidentally built a real life in the place he was supposed to be conquering, it is too late to go back. The feelings are there, the attachments are real, and they conflict violently and irreconcilably with everything he has been told he is. This is the central tension of Omni Man's character, and it is the same tension that sits at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. How do you reconcile what you were taught to be with what you have discovered you actually are? How do you honor the values that shaped you while acknowledging that those values might be wrong? How do you destroy the person you were without destroying yourself in the process? And now we need to talk about the scene that everyone who has watched Invincible remembers. The scene that defined the first season and that echoes through everything that comes after. The subway, the train, Mark's face pressed against the front of it by his own father's hand. And the question, what will you have after 500 years? That question, delivered by J.K. Simmons with a rawness that makes your chest ache even thinking about it, is the most Nietzschean moment in the entire series. And it is Nietzschean not because it is cruel, though it is. Not because it is powerful, though it is that too. It is Nietzschean because it reveals the fundamental error at the core of Nolan's worldview. He is asking the wrong question, and he does not know it. What will you have after 500 years? The assumption behind that question is that human life is meaningless because it is short, that caring about humans is foolish because they will die, that attachment to mortal beings is a weakness because loss is inevitable. And on the surface, from a purely logical standpoint, there is a cold kind of sense to it. If you are going to live for thousands of years, then yes, everyone you loved who is not a Viltrumite will die. Your human wife will age and wither and disappear. Your human friends will become memories, then faded memories, then nothing. From a certain angle, it looks like math. Cold, inevitable math. But here is what Nolan misses. Here is what the entire Viltrumite civilization misses. Nietzsche addressed this exact question, the question of meaning in the face of impermanence. And his answer was not to avoid attachment. His answer was the opposite. His answer was amor fati, love of fate. The unconditional embrace of everything that life contains, including loss, including suffering, including the knowledge that everything you love will eventually end. Amor fati is one of Nietzsche's most beautiful and most demanding ideas. It asks you to look at your life, all of it, the joy and the pain and the tedium and the heartbreak, and say yes. Not yes with conditions, not yes, but I wish this part were different. Just yes. This is my life. This is what happened, and I would live it again exactly as it was, if given the chance. The Viltrumites have no concept of amor fati. They cannot even approach it, because amor fati requires vulnerability. It requires openness to pain. It requires the willingness to be changed by experience, to be broken by loss, and to keep going anyway. And the Viltrumite Empire has spent millennia systematically eliminating vulnerability from its culture. They killed the weak. They purged the soft. They built a civilization that is allergic to anything that might resemble emotional exposure. And in doing so, they created a species that is physically invincible and philosophically bankrupt. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. The Viltrumites can survive in the vacuum of space. They can punch through planets. They can live for thousands of years. They have conquered civilizations that were old when humanity was still figuring out fire. And they have absolutely nothing meaningful to do with any of it. Their empire expands because expansion is what empires do. They conquer because conquest is what the strong do. But there is no why beneath it. No purpose beyond perpetuation. No meaning beyond the exercise of power for its own sake. They are, in Nietzsche's terms, the will to power without direction. Force without form. There is a passage in the comics, easy to miss if you are reading quickly, where a Viltrumite general describes the Empire's history. He speaks of worlds conquered, civilizations subjugated, species brought to heel. And if you listen to the way he talks about it, there is no joy, no passion, no sense of accomplishment or wonder. There is only procedure. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. This is what we will continue to do. The tone is that of an accountant reviewing quarterly results. And that absence of passion, that mechanical procedural quality, is the most damning thing about the Viltrum Empire. They are not evil in the way a fire is evil. They are not even evil in the way a tyrant is evil, because a tyrant at least wants something, at least feels something, at least has the decency to enjoy their cruelty. The Viltrumites are empty. They are a machine that runs because running is what it does, and the fuel for that machine was exhausted millennia ago. What remains is momentum, pure, purposeless momentum. Nietzsche had a word for this state of being. He called it nihilism, not the dramatic, hand-wringing nihilism of the teenager who has just discovered that life is meaningless, the deeper, more insidious nihilism of a civilization that has lost its ability to want anything beyond its own perpetuation, the nihilism of comfort, the nihilism of success, the nihilism that sets in when you have achieved everything you set out to achieve and discover that the achievement was hollow, that there was nothing at the center of it, that the goals you spent centuries pursuing were never really goals at all. They were just habits that looked like goals from the outside. The Viltrumites conquered the universe because they could, not because they wanted something from it, not because they had a vision for what a conquered universe would look like, not because they genuinely believed, that their way of life was worth spreading. They conquered because conquest was all they knew how to do. And when they ran out of things to conquer, they did not sit down and ask themselves what comes next. They just looked for more things to conquer, the same way a shark keeps swimming not because it has somewhere to go, but because stopping would kill it. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of philosophy: the will to power itself. Most people hear will to power and think it means the desire to dominate others, the desire to be on top, to control, to rule. And yes, that is how the concept was twisted and weaponized in the 20th century, most notably by the Nazis, who co-opted Nietzsche's work with the eager help of his sister Elizabeth, who edited and distorted his unpublished notes after his mental collapse. But that is not what Nietzsche meant. Not even close. The will to power, as Nietzsche actually described it, is not about dominating others. It is about overcoming yourself. It is the drive to grow, to create, to become more than what you are. It is the artist who pushes past their own limitations to create something they did not know they were capable of. It is the thinker who challenges their own assumptions because they would rather have truth than comfort. It is the person who looks at their own weaknesses, their own fears, their own failures and says, "I will not be defined by these. I will surpass them." The will to power in its authentic form is directed inward. It is self-overcoming. It is the constant process of becoming, of evolving, of transforming yourself into something greater. Not greater in the sense of more dominant, greater in the sense of more complete, more alive, more fully realized as a being. Now look at the Viltrumites again with this understanding. Their entire civilization is built on a corrupt version of the will to power. They direct all of their drive outward. They conquer planets instead of conquering themselves. They dominate other species instead of overcoming their own limitations. And their greatest limitation, the one they have never even attempted to address, is their complete inability to create meaning. They can destroy, they can subjugate, they can endure, but they cannot create. Not in any way that matters. Not art, not philosophy, not love, not purpose. They are a civilization of pure force. And pure force, without direction, without meaning, without creative expression, is nothing. It is sound and fury signifying nothing, to borrow from a different thinker. Consider the contrast with human civilization for a moment. Humanity is, by Viltrumite standards, pathetically weak. Humans die after a handful of decades, their bodies are fragile, their technology is primitive. And yet, in the brief flicker of time that human civilization has existed, it has produced more genuine creativity, more authentic expression of the will to power in its true sense, than the Viltrumites have produced in millennia. Humans write symphonies that make other humans weep. They paint murals that change how people see the world. They build cathedrals that take generations to complete, knowing they will never see the finished product. They tell stories, like the story of Invincible, that contain philosophical depths their authors might not even be fully aware of. They love fiercely and mourn deeply and argue passionately about things that do not matter at all and things that matter more than anything. They are a mess, a glorious, contradictory, infuriating mess. And that mess, that refusal to be reduced to a single principle, that insistence on being many things at once, is exactly what the will to power looks like when it is expressed honestly. The Viltrumites reduce the will to power to a single note. Humans play the entire symphony. And the single note, no matter how loudly it is played, no matter how long it sustains, will always be less than the symphony. And Nolan, standing on that blood-soaked train, holding his broken son, is the embodiment of that emptiness. He has all the power in the world. He can do anything he wants. And what does he do with it? He destroys. He kills. He hurts the person he loves most, because his programming tells him that love is weakness and weakness must be eliminated. He asks, "What will you have after 500 years?" And he does not realize that the answer is right in front of him, bloody and broken and refusing to give up. The answer is Mark. The answer is love. The answer is exactly the thing the Viltrumites spent millennia trying to purge from their species. And this is where Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch becomes essential to understanding what happens next in Nolan's story. The Übermensch, the Overman, the Superman, whatever translation you prefer, is arguably the most famous idea in Nietzsche's entire body of work. And it is also the most catastrophically misunderstood. When Nietzsche introduced the concept in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885, he was not describing a being of superior physical strength. He was not describing a conqueror or a tyrant or a master race. He was describing a mode of being, a way of existing in the world after the death of God. The Übermensch is someone who creates their own values, not out of resentment, not out of a desire to dominate, but out of a genuine, creative engagement with life. The Übermensch looks at the void where God used to be and, instead of despairing, instead of filling it with brute force or nihilistic resignation, fills it with self-created meaning. The Übermensch says, "There is no cosmic purpose, no divine plan, no inherent meaning in the universe, and that is not a tragedy. That is an opportunity to create meaning that is truly your own. To live a life that is authentically, irreducibly yours." Now think about the irony of the Viltrumites. They are literally superhuman. They are, in the most surface-level reading possible, Übermensch made real. They are stronger, faster, more durable, longer-lived than any human being could ever hope to be. They fly. They are practically immortal. They are, by every physical metric, beyond human. And they are the farthest thing from the Übermensch that Nietzsche could have imagined. Because physical superiority was never the point. It was never even close to the point. The Übermensch is about spiritual and philosophical transcendence, not physical dominance. The Übermensch creates values. The Viltrumites enforce them. The Übermensch embraces life in all its complexity. The Viltrumites reduce life to a single dimension, power. The Übermensch overcomes themselves. The Viltrumites overcome everyone else and leave themselves completely untouched. This is what Nietzsche warned us about, not the Viltrumites specifically, obviously, but the type, the archetype, the pattern. He knew, he could see with absolute clarity that his ideas would be misunderstood, that people would hear Übermensch and think Superman in the literal sense, that they would hear will to power and think domination, that they would hear beyond good and evil and think no rules apply to me. And he was right. Within decades of his death, his work was being used to justify exactly the kind of brutal, thoughtless, dehumanizing power structure that he had spent his career warning against. There is a particular cruelty in the way the Viltrumites approach conquered worlds that echoes, with uncomfortable precision, the way Nietzsche's ideas were applied to colonial and imperial projects in the real world. The Viltrumites do not simply conquer. They integrate. They send agents to live among the conquered population, to interbreed, to slowly dilute and replace the native culture until there is nothing left but a Viltrumite veneer over a hollowed-out civilization. This is not just military conquest. This is cultural annihilation disguised as partnership. And it mirrors almost exactly the way European colonial powers use distorted versions of Nietzschean and Darwinian philosophy to justify their own programs of cultural erasure. The argument was always the same. We are bringing civilization. We are bringing progress. We are helping you become more like us, because being like us is better than being like you. And that argument, that paternalistic, self-serving, fundamentally dishonest argument, is exactly what Nolan was sent to Earth to enact. He was the friendly face of conquest, the smile over the knife, the hero who was there to save you right up until the moment he was there to subjugate you. And the fact that Nolan's friendliness was partially genuine, that his smile was not entirely fake, makes it worse, not better, because it means the system works. The Viltrumite method of conquest through integration is effective precisely because it does not require its agents to be entirely dishonest. It requires them to be partially honest, partially human, partially capable of love, because partial honesty is more convincing than total deception, and partial love is more disarming than open hostility. The Viltrumites weaponized affection. They turned genuine human connection into a tool of empire. And that is perhaps the most Nietzschean horror in the entire story. Not the violence, the corruption of something real. The Viltrum Empire is the Nazi misreading of Nietzsche given cosmic scale. It is the Great Purge as racial hygiene. It is master morality as master race. It is the will to power as the will to dominate. It is every shallow, dangerous, self-serving interpretation of Nietzsche's work rolled into a civilization and set loose on the universe. And that is not a coincidence. Robert Kirkman, the creator of Invincible, built the Viltrumites on exactly that template. A species that embodies the worst possible version of Nietzschean philosophy, that takes the most profound ideas about human potential and reduces them to a fist through a chest. And now here is where things start to get really interesting. Because if the Viltrumites are the misreading, then what is the correct reading? What does the Übermensch actually look like? And is it possible that Nolan Grayson, over the course of his long and bloody and complicated life, actually becomes something closer to the real thing? Let us trace that arc. Let us follow Nolan from the moment he leaves Earth to the end of his story, and let us see if Nietzsche's philosophy can illuminate what happens to him. After the fight with Mark, after the subway, after asking that terrible question and not getting the answer he expected, Nolan leaves Earth. He flies into space, and here is what is important about that moment. He does not leave because the mission is over. He does not leave because Viltrum recalls him. He has been ordered to subjugate Earth, and he has the power to do it, and he cannot. Not because Mark stopped him. Mark did not stop him. A human father would have stopped long before the point Nolan reached. Mark was broken, barely conscious, unable to fight. Nolan could have killed him, could have killed everyone, and he does not. Why? The Viltrumite answer is that Nolan is weak, that his time on Earth corrupted him, that exposure to humans and their soft, messy, emotional way of living infected him like a virus. And in a way, that is exactly right. But what the Viltrumites call infection, Nietzsche would call something else entirely. He would call it the beginning of self-overcoming, the first crack in the wall, the moment when a being who has lived their entire life inside a rigid ideological framework starts, painfully and against their will, to outgrow it. This is what makes Nolan's departure from Earth so philosophically rich. He does not leave as a hero. He does not leave with a stirring speech about the value of human life. He leaves confused, broken, unable to reconcile what he was supposed to do with what he found himself unable to do. He is a man caught between two worlds, two value systems, two versions of himself, and the tension between them is tearing him apart. Nietzsche wrote about this exact state of being. He called it the Great Health, and despite the name, it is not a pleasant experience. The Great Health is the state of someone who has outgrown their old values but has not yet created new ones. It is the philosophical equivalent of being homeless. You have left the house you grew up in, but you have not built a new one yet. And you are standing in the rain, and you are cold, and you are wondering if leaving was the right decision. That is Nolan in the middle portion of his story, wandering the universe, taking a new partner on another planet, trying to build something new without understanding what he is building or why. He is going through the motions of a life again, the way he did on Earth. But this time, there is a difference. This time, he knows the motions are motions. He has lost the ability to perform unself-consciously. The mask has slipped, and he cannot get it back on. And this is where Nietzsche's concept of the abyss becomes relevant. You probably know the quote, even if you did not know it was Nietzsche. If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. It comes from beyond good and evil, and it is usually quoted as a warning about becoming the thing you fight. But there is a deeper reading. The abyss is not just external. It is not just the evil out there that might corrupt you. The abyss is inside you. It is the void at the center of your being, the place where meaning is supposed to be. And when you look into it honestly, when you stop distracting yourself with missions and conquests and the comfortable certainties of your ideology, you discover that it has been looking at you all along. Nolan gazed into the abyss when he held Mark against that train. And the abyss gazed back. And what it showed him was a truth he had been running from for decades. He cared about Mark, about Debbie, about the life he had built on Earth, about things that were, by Viltrumite standards, worthless. And that caring, that involuntary, unwanted, undeniable caring, was the abyss, because it meant that everything he had been taught about himself, everything the Viltrum Empire had told him he was either a lie or no longer true. And he did not know which was worse. Now, here is something most people miss entirely about Nietzsche, and it is the key to understanding the next phase of Nolan's journey. Nietzsche did not believe that transformation was something you chose in a single dramatic moment. He did not believe in epiphanies, at least not the clean, cinematic kind. He believed that real change, the kind that goes all the way down, happens through a process he described using a metaphor of 3 transformations. In the first stage, the spirit is a camel. The camel takes on burdens. It accepts the values and obligations that are given to it by its culture, its family, its civilization. It says, "Load me up, tell me what to carry. I am strong enough to bear it." This is Nolan as a loyal Viltrumite soldier. Centuries of obedience, centuries of carrying the Empire's values without question, centuries of being exactly what he was told to be. In the second stage, the spirit becomes a lion. The lion says no. It rejects the burdens, it fights the dragon of thou shalt, the accumulated weight of every external obligation and imposed value. The lion does not yet know what it wants, but it knows what it does not want. It knows that the old values are no longer sufficient. It knows that the camel's obedience was a kind of death. This is Nolan leaving Earth. Nolan defying the Viltrumite Empire. Nolan saying, I cannot do this anymore, without being able to articulate what this refers to or why he cannot do it. And in the third stage, the spirit becomes a child. Not a child in the sense of weakness or naivety, but a child in the sense of pure creative potential. The child says yes. Not yes to the old values, not yes to any external authority, but yes to life itself. The child creates new values from scratch. The child plays. The child begins again with no resentment, no bitterness, no backward-looking rage. Just the open, creative, joyful act of building something new. There is something almost unbearably intimate about this metaphor when you apply it to Nolan, because the three transformations are not just stages, they are deaths. The camel must die for the lion to be born. The lion must die for the child to emerge. And each death is painful, disorienting, and absolutely necessary. You cannot skip a stage. You cannot go from camel to child without passing through the lion. The destruction must come before the creation. The no must come before the yes. And the no must be a real no, a full-throated, bone-deep rejection of everything you used to be. Not a polite disagreement or a slight adjustment. The lion does not reform the dragon. The lion kills it. Nolan's arc, across the entire run of Invincible, follows this pattern with remarkable precision. He begins as the camel burdened with Viltrumite ideology. He becomes the lion, violently rejecting what he can no longer accept. And eventually, slowly, painfully, through decades of wandering and fighting and failing, and trying again, he begins to approach the child. He begins to create his own values. Not Viltrumite values, not human values, something new. Something that is uniquely and irreducibly his. And the value he creates, the thing he discovers at the bottom of the abyss, is something so simple that a Viltrumite would laugh at it. He discovers that love is not weakness, that caring about beings whose lives are shorter than yours is not foolishness, that the measure of a life is not its duration but its depth, that 500 years of Viltrumite emptiness is worth less than a single human lifetime lived with genuine connection. This is the real answer to the question he asked Mark on the subway. What will you have after 500 years? And the answer he could not hear then but learns to hear later, is everything. Everything that matters. Not because the people you loved are still alive, but because the love itself was real. Because the moments were real. Because the experience of being genuinely, vulnerably, terrifyingly connected to another being is the most valuable thing in the universe, and it does not become less valuable because it ends. It becomes more valuable. The impermanence is not a flaw. It is the whole point. And this is amor fati. This is what Nietzsche meant. To love your fate. To embrace your life. All of it. Even the parts that hurt. Even the parts you would give anything to change. And to say, yes, I would do it again. Not because it was easy. Not because it was painless. But because it was mine. It was real. It happened. Now, let us go deeper into the structure of the Viltrum Empire itself. Because there is another Nietzschean concept hiding in there that rarely gets discussed, and it is one of the darkest things Nietzsche ever wrote about. The concept of the last man. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when Nietzsche introduces the Übermensch, he also introduces its opposite, the last man. And the last man is not a villain. The last man is not a monster. The last man is something worse. The last man is comfortable. The last man has given up on greatness, on striving, on becoming anything more than what he already is. The last man wants a warm bed, a full stomach, and entertainment. The last man blinks and says, "We have invented happiness," and means it. The last man is content. And that contentment, to Nietzsche, is the ultimate betrayal of human potential. Because it means giving up, settling, accepting that this is all there is and that this is enough. Now, the obvious reading of Invincible is that the humans are the last men and the Viltrumites are the overmen. That is how the Viltrumites see it. That is exactly how they frame it. Humanity, with its short lives and its petty concerns and its weakness, is the last man. And Viltrumites, with their power and their ambition and their cosmic empire, are the overmen who have transcended that comfortable mediocrity. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you look at the Viltrumites closely, when you strip away the power and the immortality and the fancy costumes, they are actually closer to the last man than humanity is. Think about it. What do the Viltrumites do? They conquer. That is it. They conquer, and then they conquer some more. They have been doing the same thing for thousands of years. The same strategy, the same ideology, the same rigid, unchanging, unchallenged way of being. They do not grow. They do not evolve. They do not create anything new. They just expand. Endlessly. Mindlessly. Like a bacteria, not like a civilization. And that is the last man's defining characteristic. Not weakness, not physical softness, but the absence of striving, the absence of becoming. The last man does not try to be anything more than what he is, and neither do the Viltrumites. They decided thousands of years ago what they were, and they have not changed since. They are the most static, the most unchanging, the most philosophically dead civilization in the invincible universe. And they think this makes them strong. There is a scene in the comics where Nolan, after leaving Earth, encounters a primitive alien civilization on a distant world. And what he does there is revealing. He does not conquer them, at least not in the traditional Viltrumite sense. He lives among them, he takes a partner, he has another child, and he tries, in his confused and broken way, to start over, to build something new. But what he builds is a pale imitation of what he had on Earth, because he is not trying to create something new, he is trying to recreate something he lost. And recreation, in Nietzsche's framework, is not creation, it is nostalgia with pretensions. It is the past wearing the costume of the future. This period of Nolan's life is philosophically significant because it represents a trap that Nietzsche identified and warned against, the trap of backward-looking yearning, of trying to return to a golden age that either never existed or can never be recovered. Nietzsche called this kind of backward-looking desire resentment, and it is one of the most corrosive forces in human psychology. It is the desire to undo what has been done, to unknow what you now know, to go back to the time before the crisis, before the transformation, before the moment when everything changed. Nolan cannot go back. The camel is dead. The lion killed it, and the lion does not get to bring the camel back. The lion does not get to pretend that the rejection never happened. All the lion can do is keep roaring, keep destroying, keep saying no to the old values, until eventually the roaring exhausts itself and what remains is silence. And in that silence, if the lion is very brave and very patient, the child begins to stir. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The point is that Nolan's time on that distant world is not growth, it is stagnation. It is the philosophical equivalent of treading water. He has left the shore of his old life, but he has not yet found a new one. He is in the open ocean, and the ocean does not care how strong you are. It will drown you just as easily as it drowns anyone else. The only difference is how long it takes. Meanwhile, humanity, messy, chaotic, contradictory humanity, is constantly changing, constantly arguing about what it means to be good, what it means to be alive, what it means to matter. Humans write philosophy and compose symphonies and paint murals and fall in love and break each other's hearts and start revolutions and build hospitals and commit atrocities and then write books about why the atrocities were wrong. Humans are a disaster, and that disaster, that beautiful, uncontainable, gloriously unpredictable disaster, is exactly what Nietzsche valued most, because it means humans are still becoming, still striving, still in the process of creating themselves, still alive in the philosophical sense, not just the biological one. Nolan, when he finally begins to understand this, undergoes what Nietzsche would recognize as a genuine transvaluation of values. That is another term from Nietzsche, and it means exactly what it sounds like, a complete reversal of what you value. Things that used to seem worthless become precious. Things that used to seem precious become worthless. The entire hierarchy flips. And it is not that you change your mind the way you might change your opinion about a movie. It is that you become a different person. The person who held the old values no longer exists. The new values are held by someone new. For Nolan, the transvaluation looks like this. Strength, which was everything, becomes just a tool. Longevity, which was the measure of worth, becomes irrelevant. Empire, which was the purpose of existence, becomes a prison. And love, which was weakness, which was contemptible, which was the thing that made humans so pathetically inferior, becomes the only thing that matters. The only thing that was ever real. The only thing worth protecting. That is a staggering philosophical transformation. And it happens not through argument, not through reasoning, not through someone explaining Nietzsche to Nolan over coffee. It happens through lived experience, through the slow, grinding, undeniable pressure of reality against ideology, through the discovery that your heart does not care what your culture told you to think, through Mark, through Debbie, through the accumulated weight of every small, human, imperfect moment that Nolan experienced during his years on Earth. Stay with me here, because this next part changes everything about how you read the series. There is a concept in Nietzsche that is often considered his most profound and most challenging idea, the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche presents it as a thought experiment, and it goes like this. Imagine that you are told, by a demon or an angel or the universe itself, that you will live your life again. Not a new life, not a better life, your exact life. Every moment, every joy, every pain, every tedious afternoon, every heartbreak, every triumph, every failure, all of it in exactly the same order with exactly the same outcomes. And not just once more, but infinitely, forever, over and over and over again, without end. How would you respond to that? Think about it. Not abstractly, concretely, your life. Every embarrassing moment, every failure, every time you hurt someone or were hurt by someone, every boring Tuesday afternoon, every sleepless night, every moment of joy that ended too soon, every stretch of sadness that lasted too long. All of it, again, and again, and again, forever. Most people, when they genuinely sit with this thought experiment, find it terrifying. Because most people have parts of their lives they would rather not repeat, mistakes they would rather forget, pain they would rather leave behind. And the eternal recurrence says, no, you do not get to leave anything behind. You carry all of it, forever. That is the test of the eternal recurrence. And Nietzsche believed that the ability to say yes to it, genuinely and without reservation, was the highest achievement a human being could reach. It meant that you had lived a life so fully, so authentically, so completely your own, that you would choose it again even knowing everything that would happen. Now think about Nolan Grayson and the eternal recurrence. Think about early Nolan, Viltrumite Nolan, Omni Man at the height of his imperial loyalty. If you told that Nolan that he would have to live his life over again, he would say yes without hesitation, but not for the right reasons. He would say yes because he had not yet experienced anything that challenged him. His life up to that point was comfortable in the way the last man's life is comfortable. Predictable, uncomplicated. He knew who he was and what he was supposed to do, and he did it. There was nothing to struggle against, nothing to transform. Saying yes to that life is easy. It costs nothing. But what about later Nolan? What about the Nolan who held his son against a train and could not kill him? What about the Nolan who left Earth in shame and confusion? What about the Nolan who wandered the universe, lost, broken, unable to go back to what he was, and unable to see what he was becoming? What about the Nolan who eventually returned, who fought for Earth instead of against it, who stood beside his son and chose a different kind of strength? Would that Nolan say yes to the eternal recurrence? That is a much harder question, because saying yes to that life means saying yes to the violence, yes to the betrayal, yes to the years of complicity in the Viltrum Empire's brutality, yes to the look on Mark's face when he realized his father was a monster, yes to all of it. Not because it was good, not because it was justified, but because it was necessary. Because without those terrible, agonizing, unforgivable moments, the transformation could not have happened. The camel could not have become the lion could not have become the child, the monster could not have become the father. And this is the deepest, most uncomfortable truth in Nolan Grayson's story. His redemption does not erase his crimes, it does not make them okay. The people he killed are still dead. The lives he destroyed are still destroyed. The pain he caused is still real. Amor fati does not mean that everything that happened was good. It means that everything that happened was yours, that you own it, all of it. The glory and the shame, the heroism and the horror, and that you would not be who you are without every single piece of it. This is what separates genuine Nietzschean philosophy from the shallow version. The shallow version says, I am beyond good and evil, so nothing I do matters. The genuine version says, everything I do matters, because it is mine, and I will carry the weight of it forever. And I will say yes to carrying it because the alternative is to pretend it did not happen. And pretending is the one thing I will not do. Let us sit with that for a moment. Let that settle. Now, to understand why this matters beyond the world of Invincible, we need to talk about the real-world history of Nietzsche's ideas, and how they were transformed into something he would have despised. Friedrich Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse in 1889, and spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of severe mental incapacitation, unable to write, unable to think clearly, unable to defend his own work. He died in 1900, and in those years of helplessness, his sister Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche took control of his literary estate. Elizabeth was, to put it charitably, not a faithful custodian of her brother's legacy. She was married to Bernhard Forster, a prominent anti-Semite and German nationalist, and she edited, rearranged, and in some cases fabricated Nietzsche's unpublished notes to align with her own political agenda. The book that became The Will to Power, one of the most influential and most dangerous texts in the history of philosophy, was not a book Nietzsche wrote. It was a collection of notes that Elizabeth assembled after his collapse, arranged to support readings of his work that he had explicitly rejected during his lucid years. This matters because the version of Nietzsche that the 20th century received, the version that the Nazis adopted as their house philosopher, the version that gave us the popular image of the Übermensch as a blonde beast trampling the weak underfoot, was largely Elizabeth's creation. It was a distortion, a weaponized misreading of ideas that were, in their original form, about individual creative flourishing, not about racial supremacy or military conquest. And Nolan's journey away from those ideas, his slow, painful, confused stumble towards something more authentic, mirrors the ongoing scholarly project of recovering the real Nietzsche from beneath the layers of distortion. Just as philosophers have spent over a century trying to peel away the Nazi interpretations and find the original thinker underneath, Nolan spends decades trying to peel away the Viltrumite programming and find the person underneath. And what both projects discover is the same thing. Beneath the distortion, beneath the weaponized misreadings and the imperial ideology, there is something beautiful, something humane, something that is, paradoxically, more concerned with the flourishing of all life than with the dominance of the few. But to understand why, we need to go back to the moment everything changed, not the subway scene. Before that, the morning of the murder, when Nolan kills the Guardians of the Globe, it is presented as a sudden, shocking act of violence. And it is. But it is also something else. It is the last act of the camel, the last time Nolan does exactly what Viltrum expects him to do. The last time he carries the burden without questioning it. Because look at what happens immediately afterward. Look at his face in both the comic and the animated series. He does not look triumphant. He does not look relieved. He looks empty, hollow, like someone who has just done something they cannot undo and is only now beginning to understand what that means. The murder of the Guardians is the moment the camel's back breaks. Not because the burden was too heavy, because for the first time, the camel realized it was carrying something it did not choose. For centuries, Nolan carried Viltrumite values without question. Kill the weak, subjugate the inferior, serve the Empire. And he did it because that is what he was, that is all he knew how to be. But somewhere during his 20 years on Earth, something shifted. The values he was carrying started to feel foreign, started to feel imposed rather than chosen. And by the time he killed the Guardians, the disconnect between what he was doing and what he was feeling had become unbearable. This is what Nietzsche would call bad conscience. Not guilt in the Christian sense, not the feeling that you have sinned against a divine law, but something more fundamental. The feeling that you are acting against your own nature, that the values you are serving are not your values, that the person you are performing as is not the person you are. Bad conscience is the philosopher's version of cognitive dissonance, and it is one of the most painful experiences a conscious being can have, because it means you can no longer hide from yourself. The performance is over, the mask is off, and what is underneath is terrified. Nolan's entire arc, from the murder of the Guardians to his departure from Earth, can be read as one long, agonizing episode of bad conscience. He knows what he is supposed to do. He cannot do it. He knows what he is supposed to feel. He does not feel it. He knows who he is supposed to be. He is not that person anymore. And the violence that escalates through those episodes, the destruction, the fight with Mark, the increasingly desperate brutality, is not the violence of a conqueror enjoying his work. It is the violence of a man trying to destroy the evidence of his own transformation. If he can be brutal enough, if he can be cold enough, if he can do what Viltrum asks with enough conviction, then maybe the transformation is not real. Maybe the feelings are not real. Maybe he can go back to being the camel. He cannot. And the moment he realizes he cannot is the moment the lion is born. And here is something that needs to be said clearly, because it is easy to get lost in the philosophy and forget the human cost. Nolan's transformation does not excuse what he did. The Guardians are dead. Thousands of civilians are dead. Mark, his own son, is traumatized in ways that will never fully heal. Debbie's life is shattered. These are real consequences, real suffering, real damage, and no amount of philosophical growth makes them okay. But Nietzsche never said that the Übermensch was innocent. He never said that the path to authentic existence was clean or painless or free of moral compromise. What he said was that the path was necessary, that the alternative, staying the camel, carrying values you did not choose, living a life that is not your own, was a different kind of death, a death of the spirit. And that given the choice between a painful transformation and a comfortable death, the genuine thinker, the genuine seeker, the genuine human being would choose the pain every time. Whether that is true is a question you have to answer for yourself. Nietzsche does not get to decide that for you. No philosopher does. But it is the question that Invincible asks, over and over again, through Nolan's story and through Mark's, and through every character who has to decide what they are willing to sacrifice. in order to become who they really are. There is another dimension to this that is worth exploring, and it has to do with the role of suffering in Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche did not believe that suffering was good. He was not a masochist and he was not advocating for pain as an end in itself, but he did believe that suffering was necessary. Specifically, he believed that suffering was the forge in which authentic selfhood was created. Without suffering, without challenge, without the experience of having your deepest assumptions shattered and your most cherished beliefs proven wrong, you could not grow, you could not transform, you could not become. The Viltrumites attempted to eliminate suffering from their civilization, not by creating a world without pain, which is what a compassionate civilization might try to do, but by eliminating anyone who could feel pain deeply enough for it to matter. The Great Purge was, among other things, an attempt to breed suffering out of the Viltrumite genome. And in a purely physical sense, it worked. Viltrumites are nearly impossible to hurt. Their bodies heal from wounds that would kill any other species. They are, in the most literal sense, invulnerable to most forms of physical suffering. But Nietzsche would point out that physical suffering was never the most important kind. The suffering that transforms, the suffering that forges, is psychological, emotional, spiritual. It is the suffering of realizing you were wrong, the suffering of losing something you cannot replace, the suffering of confronting who you really are underneath the armor of your ideology. And that kind of suffering, no amount of genetic engineering can eliminate, because it comes not from the body, but from the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. And the wider that gap, the greater the suffering when it finally closes. For Nolan, the gap was enormous, centuries wide. He had spent his entire life believing he was a soldier, a conqueror, a loyal servant of the greatest empire in the universe. And then, over the course of 20 years on a small blue planet, he discovered that he was also a husband, a father, a person capable of love. And the suffering that came from that discovery, the suffering of realizing that the two versions of himself could not coexist, was more intense than any physical wound the universe could inflict on him. Viltrumite durability is useless against that kind of pain. You cannot heal from it by being strong. You can only heal from it by being honest. And honesty, genuine philosophical honesty, the willingness to look at yourself without flinching, is the one quality the Viltrum Empire never cultivated. Because honesty requires vulnerability. And vulnerability to a Viltrumite is death. Except it is not. Vulnerability is life. It is the beginning of life. It is the crack in the wall through which light enters. And Nolan's story is, at its core, the story of a being who was built to be in vulnerable learning. Against every instinct and every piece of conditioning, that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It is the source of it. Now, let us talk about Mark for a moment, because Mark is essential to understanding Nolan's philosophical journey. And not just as a catalyst, Mark Grayson, Invincible, is in many ways the counterpoint to every Nietzschean distortion the Viltrumites represent. He is half Viltrumite, half human. He has the power. He has the potential for the kind of transcendence the Viltrumites claim, but he chooses, consistently, stubbornly, sometimes foolishly, to remain connected to humanity, to remain compassionate, to remain open to pain and loss and the messy, unpredictable business of caring about people. And here is the thing that most philosophical readings of Invincible miss. Mark is not the opposite of the Ubermensch. Mark might actually be closer to the Ubermensch than any Viltrumite, including Nolan. Because Mark creates his own values. He does not accept the Viltrumite framework. He does not accept the human framework entirely either. He looks at both worlds, both value systems, and he builds something new, something that takes the best of both and leaves the worst behind. He takes the Viltrumite capacity for strength and refuses to let it become cruelty. He takes the human capacity for love and refuses to let it become weakness. That is the Ubermensch. That is what Nietzsche was talking about. Not a being who stands above humanity and looks down. A being who stands within humanity and reaches up. Not someone who transcends human values by rejecting them, but someone who transcends them by fulfilling them, by taking them further than anyone thought they could go, by showing what love and compassion and connection look like when they are backed by the strength to actually protect them. And Nolan, watching his son become this, watching Mark build the thing he himself could never build, experiences something that the Viltrumite Empire has no word for. He experiences admiration for someone who is, by Viltrumite standards, his inferior. He experiences pride in someone who has rejected everything Viltrum stands for. He experiences the recognition that his son is better than him. Not stronger, better. And that recognition, that willingness to be surpassed by your own child, is one of the most profoundly Nietzschean moments in the entire story. Because the Ubermensch is not the endpoint. The Ubermensch is not a final destination. The Ubermensch is a bridge between what humanity is and what it could become. And a bridge is not meant to be worshipped. A bridge is meant to be crossed. Nolan, by the end of his story, understands that he is the bridge, that his role was not to be the Ubermensch himself, but to create the conditions for someone else to become it, to make the mistakes, to pay the price, to go through the fire, so that Mark would not have to. That is not a Viltrumite thought. That is not a conqueror's thought. That is a father's thought. And it is, in its own quiet way, the most revolutionary thing in the entire Invincible universe. There is something else worth considering about the father-son dynamic in Invincible, and it connects to one of the quieter threads in Nietzsche's thought. Nietzsche, for all his talk of overcoming and transformation, was deeply preoccupied with the question of inheritance. Not genetic inheritance, though that was part of it. Cultural inheritance, philosophical inheritance, the question of what we pass down to those who come after us, and whether what we pass down liberates them or imprisons them. The Viltrumites passed down an ideology, a rigid, unquestioning, unquestionable ideology that has remained unchanged for millennia. Each generation of Viltrumites receives the same values, the same beliefs, the same definition of what it means to be a Viltrumite. And each generation accepts them without modification. There is no Viltrumite version of a generation gap, no Viltrumite teenagers rebelling against their parents' values, no Viltrumite philosophers asking whether the old ways still make sense. The inheritance is total, and it is accepted totally, and the result is a civilization that has achieved biological immortality while remaining philosophically stillborn. Nolan's gift to Mark, and it is a gift even though it came wrapped in violence and betrayal and trauma, is the opposite of the Viltrumite inheritance. Nolan gave Mark a crisis. He gave him the experience of having his entire world shattered. He gave him the terrible, transformative knowledge that the person he trusted most was not who he appeared to be, and that the values he grew up with were built on a lie. And that crisis, painful as it was the most valuable thing Nolan could have given his son, because it forced Mark to build his own values from scratch. It forced him to decide, for himself, what kind of person he wanted to be. It forced him to become, in the truest sense, Nietzsche would have understood this perfectly. He wrote often about the value of crisis, about how the destruction of inherited values, while terrifying, is also liberating. Because once your inherited values are gone, once the rug has been pulled out from under you and you are lying on the floor looking up at a ceiling that suddenly seems very far away, you have a choice. You can try to put the rug back. You can spend the rest of your life trying to reconstruct the world as it was before the crisis. Or you can stand up and build something new, something that is yours in a way the old thing never was. Mark chose to build, and what he built, the set of values he created out of the wreckage of his relationship with his father, is more authentically Nietzschean than anything the Viltrum Empire has ever produced. Not because it is perfect, not because it is without contradiction, but because it is his. It was not inherited. It was not imposed. It was forged in the fire of personal experience, and it bears the marks of that forging. And those marks are what make it real. Now, there is one more concept we need to explore, and it is perhaps the most subtle and the most important of all. It is a concept that Nietzsche returned to again and again, in different forms and with different emphases, throughout his career. And it is the concept that ultimately separates the authentic reading of his philosophy from the distorted one. That concept is life affirmation. Everything Nietzsche wrote, when you strip away the provocations and the polemics and the deliberately inflammatory rhetoric, comes back to a single question: are you for life or against it? Do you affirm existence with all its suffering and beauty and absurdity, or do you deny it? Do you say yes to the world as it is, or do you retreat into fantasies about how it should be? The Viltrumites are against life. That sounds paradoxical, because they are so vigorously alive, so powerful, so determined to survive. But survival is not the same as life affirmation. The Viltrumites survive, they endure, they persist, but they do not truly live. They do not embrace the fullness of existence. They eliminate everything that does not serve their narrow definition of strength. They purge vulnerability, creativity, compassion, love, wonder, doubt, curiosity, all of the things that make existence rich and strange and worth experiencing. They are left with power and duration, which is to say, they are left with almost nothing. Life affirmation, in Nietzsche's sense, means saying yes to everything. Yes to joy and to suffering. Yes to creation and to destruction. Yes to love and to loss. Yes to the fact that you will die and that everyone you love will die and that nothing lasts forever. Yes to all of it, not because you enjoy suffering, but because suffering is part of the package, and the package is worth accepting in its entirety. There is a passage in Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, the autobiography he wrote shortly before his mental collapse, where he describes what it feels like to affirm life fully. He says, It feels like gratitude. Not gratitude for the good things. Gratitude for everything, for the totality of existence, for the fact that you are here, that you are alive, that you get to experience this strange, beautiful, terrible thing called being conscious in a universe that did not have to contain consciousness at all. That gratitude, that overwhelming, irrational, philosophically unjustifiable gratitude for the sheer fact of existence, is what Nietzsche considered the highest state a human being could achieve. And you can see echoes of that gratitude in the later chapters of Nolan's story. Not the loud, dramatic gratitude of a man who has been saved from drowning. The quiet, almost bewildered gratitude of a man who realizes, after centuries of taking everything for granted, that he was given something extraordinary and almost threw it away. The gratitude of a father who comes within inches of losing his son and then spends the rest of his life marveling that the son is still there, still willing to talk to him, still willing to be his son. That gratitude is not redemption. Redemption implies that the past has been resolved, that the debt has been paid, that the slate is clean. Nolan's slate will never be clean. But gratitude does not require a clean slate. Gratitude does not require innocence. Gratitude only requires presence, the willingness to be here, fully, in this moment without hiding from anything you have done or anything that has been done to you. And this is what Nolan learns, slowly, reluctantly, through decades of pain and confusion and the gradual, grudging recognition that the Viltrumite way of being is not strong. It is afraid. Afraid of loss. Afraid of change. Afraid of anything that cannot be controlled through force. The Viltrumites are the most frightened civilization in the universe. They just hide it well behind invulnerability and aggression. Nolan's transformation is, at its core, a movement from fear to acceptance, from denial to affirmation, from the Viltrumite no, which rejects everything that is not power, to a human yes, which embraces everything that is real. And that movement, that journey from no to yes, is the entire arc of Nietzsche's philosophy in miniature. There is a beautiful and terrible moment in the comics where Nolan, now fighting for Earth instead of against it, is confronted with the full reality of what he has done. Not by a villain, not by a cosmic tribunal, by himself, by the memory of who he was and what he did. And he does not flinch from it. He does not make excuses. He does not claim that the ends justified the means, or that he was a different person then. He stands in the full light of his own history and he says, in effect, yes, that was me. I did those things. And I am not that person anymore, but I carry those things with me. And I will carry them forever, and that is the price of becoming who I am now. That is amor fati in its purest, most demanding form. And it is the moment when Nolan Grayson completes his philosophical transformation, not from villain to hero, from the misreading to the real thing, from what Nietzsche warned against to what Nietzsche hoped for, from the monster to the father, from the conqueror to the creator, from the Viltrumite to the overman. Not a perfect overman, not a clean or comfortable or easy to admire overman. A broken, scarred, guilt-ridden overman who carries the weight of everything he has done and says yes to all of it anyway. Because what other choice is there? The only alternative is to pretend it did not happen. And pretending, as we have established, is the one thing the Übermensch will not do. And this brings us to the question that has been hovering over this entire discussion. Is Omni Man what Nietzsche warned us about, or is he what Nietzsche hoped for? The answer is both. And that is the genius of the character. At the beginning, Nolan is the warning. He is the misreading incarnate. He is the will to power corrupted into the will to dominate. He is the Übermensch reduced to a Superman. He is beyond good and evil in the laziest, most dangerous sense, the sense that means no moral obligations apply to me because I am too strong to be constrained. He is everything that went wrong with Nietzsche's legacy in the 20th century, everything that Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche distorted, everything that the Nazis co-opted, everything that turned the most misunderstood philosopher in history into the patron saint of bullies and tyrants. And at the end, Nolan is the hope. He is the real thing, or at least as close to the real thing as a fictional character can get. He is the will to power directed inward, the drive to overcome himself rather than others. He is the Übermensch as creator, not destroyer. He is beyond good and evil in the genuine sense. The sense that means I have created my own values through lived experience and I take full responsibility for them. He is amor fati. He is the great health. He is the child who says yes. The distance between those two Nolans, between the warning and the hope, is the entire span of Nietzsche's philosophy. And the fact that one character can contain both, that one person can be both the disease and the cure, is a testament to how deeply Invincible engages with these ideas, whether it does so consciously or not. And perhaps that is the most Nietzschean thing about Invincible. Nietzsche believed that the most profound truths were not found in academic philosophy, or in sacred texts, or in the pronouncements of wise men. He believed they were found in art, in stories, in the messy, emotional, irrational, beautiful business of human creativity. He believed that a great novel, or a great painting, or a great piece of music could contain more genuine philosophical insight than 1,000 dissertations. And he would have recognized Invincible, with its bloody battles and its superhero costumes and its melodramatic plot twists, as exactly that kind of art. Not philosophy pretending to be entertainment that turns out to contain philosophy. The real kind, the kind that changes how you see the world. There is something else happening in Invincible that is worth naming before we move toward the close of this discussion, and it is something that connects Nolan's individual story to a much larger pattern in contemporary culture. We live in an era that is fascinated by the idea of the anti-hero, the morally complex protagonist, the character who is neither purely good nor purely evil, but exists somewhere in between, navigating shades of gray. And the best of these characters, the ones that stay with you long after the story is over, share something with Nolan Grayson, and something with Nietzsche's philosophy. They embody the tension between inherited values and authentic ones. They are characters in the process of becoming, not finished products, works in progress. Walter White, Tony Soprano, Jaime Lannister, Vegeta, Zuko, the list goes on. These are characters who fascinate us because they are doing, in a dramatic and compressed form, what all of us are doing all the time. They are figuring out who they are. They are sorting through the rubble of their conditioning and trying to build something meaningful out of whatever they find. And sometimes they succeed, and sometimes they do both at the same time. And that messiness, that refusal to resolve neatly into good or evil, is what makes them feel real. Nolan Grayson belongs at the top of that list because his transformation is not just dramatic, it is philosophical. It is not just a change in behavior, it is a change in being. He does not simply stop doing bad things and start doing good things. He transforms the entire framework through which he understands what good and bad mean. And that is rarer and more profound than any simple redemption arc. That is not a character who learns to be better within an existing moral system. That is a character who dismantles one moral system and builds another, from scratch, in the dark, with no instructions. But there is something we have not yet addressed directly, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable parallel between the Viltrumites and the real-world abuse of Nietzsche's ideas. We need to talk about race, about nationalism, about the specific, explicit, documented ways in which Nietzsche warned against exactly the kind of biological supremacism that the Viltrum Empire embodies. Because here is a fact that the popular image of Nietzsche consistently ignores. Nietzsche hated nationalism. He despised it. He wrote against it with a venom he reserved for very few other targets. In his private letters, he raged against anti-Semites who tried to claim him as one of their own. He called them deformities. He asked, with genuine anguish, how people could mouth the name Zarathustra while promoting race hatred. He described nationalism as a sickness, a scabies of the heart, a blood poisoning that was leading Europe toward quarantine and isolation. He did not whisper these objections in footnotes. He shouted them in his published works, in his letters, in everything he wrote during his lucid years. In Beyond Good and Evil, in the section called Peoples and Fatherlands, Nietzsche laid out his vision of what he called the good European. Not the good German, not the good Aryan. The good European, a cosmopolitan spirit who transcended the petty tribalism of national identity. A being who refused to define themselves by the accident of their birth. A thinker who understood that greatness does not come from blood or soil, but from the individual's willingness to overcome the limitations of their particular culture. Now, think about the Viltrumites and tell me they are not the exact opposite of what Nietzsche was describing. The Viltrumites define themselves entirely by blood. Their entire civilization is organized around the principle that Viltrumite biology is superior, and that this biological superiority grants them the right to rule. They are, in the most literal sense, a master race. They purged their own population to strengthen the gene pool. They conquered other species not because those species posed a threat, but because those species were genetically inferior. They sent agents to interbreed with conquered populations not out of love or curiosity, but to dilute the native genome and replace it with Viltrumite DNA. This is racial supremacism. There is no other word for it, and it is exactly, precisely, without any ambiguity whatsoever, what Nietzsche spent his career arguing against. The man who wrote about the Übermensch was not writing about a biological category. He was writing about a spiritual achievement. The Übermensch is not born. The Übermensch is made through suffering, through creativity, through the painful process of self-overcoming. You do not inherit the Übermensch through your bloodline. You earn it through the quality of your existence. The Viltrumites believe the opposite. They believe greatness is genetic. They believe that the strong deserve to rule because strength is coded into their biology. And that belief, that substitution of biological destiny for individual achievement, is the thing Nietzsche warned against more than almost anything else. Because once you locate greatness in blood rather than in spirit, you have done something catastrophic to the concept. You have made it unchosen, unearned, automatic. And an automatic greatness is no greatness at all. It is just an accident of birth wearing a crown it did not earn. This is why Nietzsche broke with his former friend Richard Wagner, who had become increasingly nationalist and anti-Semitic in his later years. This is why Nietzsche ended his relationship with his sister Elizabeth when she married the anti-Semite Bernhard Forster. This is why he described himself as anti-political, because he saw that nationalism, wherever it appeared, destroyed the capacity for genuine thought. It replaced individual judgment with tribal loyalty. It replaced the question of what is true with the question of what serves the group. And a being who has stopped asking what is true has, in Nietzsche's eyes, stopped being fully human. The Viltrumites have never asked what is true. They have only ever asked what serves the empire. And that distinction, the distinction between truth-seeking and power-serving, is the fault line that runs through Nietzsche's entire body of work. On one side stands the genuine philosopher, the genuine Übermensch, the being who pursues truth even when truth is painful and inconvenient, and destructive to their own assumptions. On the other side stands the ideologue, the nationalist, the racial supremacist, the being who cherry-picks whatever ideas serve their pre-existing conclusion and discards everything else. The Viltrumites are ideologues, every single one of them, including Nolan at the beginning. They did not arrive at their worldview through inquiry, they received it through indoctrination. And the difference between a conclusion you reach through honest thought and a conclusion you receive through cultural programming is the difference between a house you built and a prison you were born in. And here is where it gets personal for Nolan. Because his journey away from Viltrumite ideology is also a journey away from racial supremacism. When he begins to see humans as equals, when he begins to love a human woman and raise a half-human son, he is committing the most fundamental heresy the Viltrum Empire can conceive. He is saying through his actions, if not yet through his words, that Viltrumite blood is not the measure of worth. That a being with half the Viltrumite genome can be just as valuable, just as worthy of love and respect and admiration, as a being with the full complement. That is not a small concession. For a Viltrumite, that is the equivalent of dismantling the entire philosophical foundation of their civilization. And Nolan does it not through argument, but through the simple, undeniable experience of watching his half-human son become someone extraordinary. Stay with me here because this connects to something even deeper. The Viltrumites are a species that never needed gods. That fact, which seems like a small piece of world building when you first encounter it, is actually one of the most philosophically loaded details in the entire Invincible universe. The Viltrumites evolved on a world where they were the apex species from the beginning. They were never prey, they were never vulnerable, they never looked up at the sky and wondered if something bigger than themselves was watching. They never needed religion because they never needed comfort. And religion, whatever else it might be, begins as a response to the terror of being small and mortal in a vast and indifferent universe. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead only carries weight in a civilization that once believed God was alive. The death of God is a crisis because it leaves a void, and that void demands to be filled. But the Viltrumites never had a void. They never had a god to kill. Their universe was never enchanted in the first place. There was never a moment in Viltrumite history when a Viltrumite philosopher stood in a marketplace with a lantern and announced that they had killed the source of all meaning. Because for the Viltrumites, there was never a source of meaning external to themselves. They were always the most powerful thing in their world. They were always, in their own eyes, the gods. And this creates a philosophical problem that is actually more severe than the one Nietzsche diagnosed in European civilization. When God dies in a culture that once believed, the void is at least recognized. People can feel the absence. They can name it. They can mourn it. They can, if they are brave enough and creative enough, begin the work of filling it with self-created meaning. But the Viltrumites have no void to fill because they never had a god to lose. They have something worse. They have a complete absence of the experience of transcendence. They have never felt small. They have never felt awe. They have never looked at something greater than themselves and felt that mixture of terror and wonder that is the beginning of all genuine philosophy. Think about what that means for a civilization. Think about what you lose when you have never been humbled. The Viltrumites have no art, at least none that the comics or the series ever describes as meaningful. They have no music, no literature, no philosophy in the human sense. They have military strategy, and they have ideology, and they have the rigid, unchanging code of conduct that passes for culture in their civilization. But they do not have the thing that makes culture matter. They do not have the experience of reaching for something beyond themselves. They do not have the experience of being insufficient and knowing it and creating something beautiful out of that insufficiency. Human art exists because humans are mortal and know it. Human philosophy exists because humans are confused and know it. Human love exists in its deepest form because humans are alone and know it. Every great achievement of human civilization is, at its root, a response to limitation. A response to the terrifying knowledge that you are small and temporary and probably wrong about most things. And that response, that creative, desperate, magnificent response to the fact of your own inadequacy, is worth more than all the Viltrumite power in the universe, because it is the only honest response. The only response that begins with the truth rather than a comfortable lie about your own supremacy. The Viltrumites began with a lie. The lie that they were enough, that their power was sufficient, that there was nothing beyond themselves worth reaching for. And that lie, comfortable as it was, sealed them inside a world without wonder, a world without growth, a world where the ceiling is exactly as high as your fist can reach and no higher. Nolan, on Earth, experienced something the Viltrum Empire could not have predicted. He experienced insufficiency, not physical insufficiency. He could still punch through buildings and fly faster than sound, but emotional insufficiency, relational insufficiency. The dawning, disorienting realization that his power could not make Debbie love him, could not make Mark respect him, could not bridge the gap between what he was and what his family needed him to be. For perhaps the first time in his millennia-long existence, Nolan encountered a problem that strength could not solve. And that encounter, that collision between Viltrumite power and human complexity, cracked open something inside him that had been sealed shut since before the Great Purge. It cracked open the capacity for awe, for wonder, for the terrifying recognition that there are things in the universe more interesting and more valuable than being able to hit hard. A human woman who saw through his performance and loved him anyway. A half-human son who inherited his strength and his wife's heart and somehow combined them into something neither Viltrumite culture nor human culture could have produced alone. A planet full of beings who were, by every Viltrumite metric, beneath notice, and who had nevertheless created art and music and philosophy and love and meaning in quantities that the entire Viltrum Empire, across all its millennia of existence, had never approached. Now, here is something most people miss entirely about the later arc of the Invincible comics, and it connects to one of the most radical claims Nietzsche ever made. Nolan does not just reject Viltrumite ideology. He does not just walk away from the Empire. He becomes the Emperor after it is discovered that Nolan is the son of Lord Argal, the former ruler of the Viltrum Empire. He is placed on the Viltrumite throne. And what does he do with that power? He tries to change the empire from within. He tries to redirect millennia of conquest and domination towards something that resembles coexistence. He takes the throne not to perpetuate what it has always stood for, but to transform it into something it has never been. This is, in Nietzsche's terms, the ultimate act of self-overcoming projected onto a civilization. Nolan does not destroy the Viltrum Empire. He tries to overcome it. He tries to take the raw material of Viltrumite power, the strength, the durability, the sheer force of a species built for domination, and redirect it toward creation rather than destruction. It is as if the lion, having killed the dragon of Thou Shalt, sat down on the dragon's throne and tried to teach the other lions to become children. It is an almost impossibly ambitious act of philosophical transformation, and it is doomed to be messy and imperfect and full of compromise, which is exactly what makes it authentic. Because Nietzsche never promised that the Übermensch would be clean. He never promised that the creation of new values would be a smooth or elegant process. He described the Übermensch as someone who must be ready to burn themselves in their own flame in order to rise anew from the ashes. The phoenix metaphor is deliberate. Transformation requires destruction. Not the destruction of others, which is what the Viltrumites always defaulted to, but the destruction of yourself, of your old self, of the comfortable, familiar, deeply held beliefs that kept you safe and small and certain. Nolan burns, not literally, though the comics give him plenty of physical suffering as well. He burns philosophically. He burns every assumption he ever held about what makes a life valuable. He burns the Viltrumite certainty that power equals worth. He burns the comfortable lie that emotion is weakness. He burns the imperial logic that says conquered species are resources, not beings. And what rises from those ashes is not the same person who went in. It cannot be. That is the whole point. And here is where we need to address the question of Thrag, because Thrag represents the version of Nolan that refused to burn. Thrag, the former Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, is in many ways Nolan's philosophical shadow. He is what Nolan would have remained if Earth had not changed him. Thrag is the purest expression of Viltrumite ideology in the entire series. He is the will to power corrupted into the will to dominate. Without a single crack in the armor, without a single moment of doubt or vulnerability or wonder, he is the Viltrumite ideal made flesh, and he is, for exactly that reason, the most philosophically dead character in the story. Thrag does not transform. He cannot transform. He has no mechanism for self-overcoming, because he has no self to overcome. He is pure ideology, pure function. He is the Empire's values walking around in a body, and when those values are challenged, he does not grow or change or adapt. He doubles down. He fights harder. He kills more. He throws his own children at his enemies like projectiles, watching them splatter on impact because they are not strong enough to survive the collision. And he does not flinch, because to Thrag, even his children are not beings. They are tools, extensions of his will, resources to be deployed and discarded as the mission requires. If Nolan is the Viltrumite who discovered the capacity for love, Thrag is the Viltrumite who never will. And the final battle between them, the battle in which Thrag tears out Nolan's heart, is not just a fight between two powerful beings. It is a philosophical argument conducted through violence. It is the question of whether transformation is possible, whether the Viltrumite machine can produce a genuine individual, answered in blood and fire and the most intimate kind of destruction. Thrag kills Nolan. That is the brutal, irreversible fact. He reaches into the man who was trying to change everything, and he tears out the organ that both literally and metaphorically represents everything Nolan became. The heart. The thing the Viltrumites spent millennia trying to breed out of their species. The thing that made Nolan stop on that subway platform. The thing that made him leave Earth not as a conqueror, but as a confused, broken man who had discovered, too late, that he was capable of love. Thrag tears it out, and Nolan dies. But here is what Thrag does not understand, what the entire Viltrumite ideology of domination cannot comprehend. Killing the individual does not kill what the individual created. Nolan's values, the values he forged in the fire of his own transformation, do not die with him. They live on in Mark. They live on in every choice Mark makes, every time he uses Viltrumite strength in service of human compassion, every time he reaches for connection instead of conquest. Nolan was the bridge, and the bridge was crossed, and it does not matter that the bridge was destroyed afterward. What matters is what made it to the other side. And what made it to the other side is Mark Grayson, who might be the closest thing to the actual Ubermensch in all of contemporary fiction. Not because he is the strongest, not because he defeats Thrag, though he does, in a battle so savage it ends with Mark biting through Thrag's throat because both his arms are broken, and he has nothing left but his teeth and his refusal to stop. Mark is the Ubermensch because he creates values, because he takes the Viltrumite capacity for power and the human capacity for love, and he fuses them into something neither species could have produced alone. Because he looks at the void where his father's certainty used to be, and he fills it not with domination and not with despair, but with something new, something that is his, something that was forged in the worst possible circumstances, and is, for exactly that reason, unbreakable. Nietzsche wrote that he loved those who do not know how to live except by going under, for they are the ones who cross over. Mark goes under, again and again and again. He is beaten, betrayed, broken, forced to watch his father kill his mentors, forced to fight his own family, forced to carry the weight of a legacy that was built on blood and conquest. He goes under so completely and so thoroughly that there are moments in the story where it seems impossible that he could come back. And then he comes back, not because he is strong, though he is, because he has chaos in himself. And out of that chaos, he gives birth to something that the orderly, rigid, philosophically dead Viltrum Empire could never produce. A dancing star. A new way of being. Consider what Mark does with the Viltrum Empire after Nolan's death and Thrag's defeat. He becomes the ruler of the Viltrumites, not by conquest, but by inheritance, by the right that his father's transformation and his own choices earned him. And he guides the Viltrumites, slowly, imperfectly, towards something that resembles coexistence with the universe they once tried to subjugate. He does not destroy the Empire. He does not punish the Viltrumites for what they were. He transforms what they could become. That is not revenge. That is not justice in any simple sense. That is creation. That is the child in Nietzsche's metaphor, building something new out of the ashes of the old. And there is something almost unbearably poignant about the fact that Nolan does not live to see it. He does not live to see his son become the thing he himself could never fully be. He does not live to see the values he created, painfully and imperfectly, and too late, take root in someone who could carry them further than he ever could. He dies as the bridge, and the bridge's purpose is to be crossed, not to admire the view from the other side. But consider the eternal recurrence one more time, applied not to the early Nolan or the middle Nolan, but to the Nolan who dies with his heart torn out, having spent his final years trying to transform the very empire that created him. Would that Nolan say yes? Would he choose to live it all again? The centuries of mindless conquest, the years of deception on Earth, the moment he killed the Guardians, the subway, the wandering, the throne, the battle, the hand reaching into his chest. The answer, and this is the part that breaks your heart if you let it, is yes, because without every single one of those moments, Mark does not exist. The transformation does not happen. The bridge is never built. And a yes that includes the worst of your life alongside the best. A yes that embraces the horror along with the hope. A yes that does not flinch and does not bargain, and does not try to edit out the painful parts. That is amor fati in its most complete and most devastating form. Nolan's death is not a tragedy in the simple sense. It is the completion of something. The final act of a being who spent centuries as the warning, and who died, at the last, as something closer to the hope. Not a clean hope, not a comfortable one, a hope soaked in blood and compromise and the knowledge that he could never fully atone for what he had done, but a real hope. The kind that does not pretend, the kind that carries its own weight, the kind that says, this is what I became, and it was not enough, and it was everything. There is one more thread to pull before we bring this together, and it has to do with the concept Nietzsche introduced in Zarathustra, when he said that man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man, he wrote, is that he is a bridge and not an end. Think about the word he chose. Not a destination, a bridge, a means of crossing something that exists not for its own sake, but for the sake of what it makes possible. Every character in Invincible can be placed somewhere on that rope. The Viltrumites, despite their physical superiority, are closer to the beast, not because they are evil in a simplistic sense, but because they have refused the crossing. They have looked at the rope and said, we are already on the other side. We are already the overmen. And by making that claim, by refusing to recognize that they still have a crossing to make, they have anchored themselves to the beast end of the rope and called it the destination. Thrag is the beast that believes it is already the overman. Nolan is the rope itself, stretched agonizingly between what he was and what he wanted to become, holding on despite the abyss beneath him, despite the fact that the crossing was tearing him apart. And Mark is the one who makes it across. Not perfectly, not without scars, but across. And that is the image to hold in your mind when you think about what Nietzsche actually meant. Not gods, not supermen, not beings of infinite power looking down at the rest of us from some cosmic throne. Just people, ordinary and extraordinary and everything in between, making the crossing, reaching for something better than what they were given, daring to create meaning in a universe that did not bother to provide any. And that is Nietzsche's entire project, summarized in a single character arc: the dismantling of inherited values, the darkness of the void, and the slow, painful, miraculous construction of something new. So the next time you watch Omni Man fly through the sky, think about what you are seeing. Not a superhero, not a villain, not a reformed bad guy making amends. A philosophical experiment, a living test case for the most dangerous and most beautiful ideas in the history of human thought. A being who was built to be the warning and who chose, against everything he was and everything he was taught, to become the hope instead. And think about what that means for you, not in the grand philosophical sense, in the personal sense. Because Nietzsche was not writing for civilizations, he was writing for individuals, for you. For the person lying in bed right now, listening to this, maybe drifting off, maybe thinking about their own life and their own values and their own inherited ideas about what they are supposed to be. You probably have your own Viltrumite programming. We all do. Not the conquering planets kind, the quieter kind. The ideas about success and failure that you absorbed from your culture without choosing them. The definitions of strength and weakness that were handed to you before you were old enough to question them. The voice in your head that tells you what you should want, who you should be, what kind of life is worth living. That voice is your Viltrum empire, and you do not have to listen to it. That does not mean rejecting everything you were taught. It does not mean burning down your life and starting over. It means doing what Nolan eventually did. Looking honestly at the values you carry and asking, are these mine? Did I choose these? Or did someone load them onto my back when I was too young to say no? And if they are not yours, if they never were, then the question becomes, what values would you choose? If you were starting from scratch, if you could create your own meaning from the ground up, what would it look like? That is the question Nietzsche spent his entire career asking. Not what should you believe, but what do you believe? Not what does society say is good, but what do you say is good? Not how should you live, but how will you live? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are the most practical, the most urgent, the most deeply personal questions you will ever face. And they do not have easy answers. The whole point is that they do not have easy answers. If they did, Nietzsche would not have needed to write 20 books about them. If they did, Nolan would not have needed 144 issues and 4 seasons to work through them. The answers have to be discovered, lived, earned. They cannot be handed to you by a philosopher or a parent or a culture or an empire, no matter how powerful that empire might be. But the discovery is worth it. That is the final lesson of Nietzsche's philosophy and the final lesson of Nolan Grayson's story. The discovery is worth it. The pain is worth it. The confusion is worth it. The terrifying, exhilarating, disorienting process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you were told to be, is the most valuable thing you will ever do. And if all of that sounds too heavy, too philosophical, too much for a Tuesday night or a Wednesday morning or whenever you happen to be listening to this, consider this. Nietzsche did not write his philosophy for the strong. He wrote it for the tired. He wrote it for the sick. He wrote it for the body that was failing him, in rooms that were cold and quiet and empty, for an audience that did not exist yet. He wrote it because he believed, despite everything, that human beings were capable of more than they thought they were. Not more power, more depth, more authenticity, more life. You do not need to fly through mountains. You do not need to live for 1,000 years. You do not need to be invincible. You just need to be willing to change. And that willingness, that simple, terrifying, extraordinary willingness to change, is the one thing no empire can take from you. Not the Viltrum Empire, not the empire of your own habits and assumptions and inherited beliefs. None of them can touch that willingness because it lives in a place that is deeper than conditioning, deeper than culture, deeper than anything that was put into you from the outside. It lives in the place where you are most genuinely, most irreducibly yourself, and it is waiting for you to use it. And here is one final thought to carry with you as you drift off tonight. The very last panel of the Invincible comic, the very last image after 144 issues of blood and philosophy and love and destruction, is a scene of ordinary life. Mark grown old, surrounded by his family, no capes, no battles, no Viltrumite ideology, just a man who inherited the power of a god and chose to be human, who looked into the abyss and found not darkness, but depth, who was offered the misreading and chose the real thing instead. That is what Nietzsche hoped for. Not gods flying above us, but people here among us choosing to be fully, authentically, courageously alive, creating meaning in a world that does not come with any, saying yes to a life that does not promise to be easy, saying yes anyway. If you enjoyed this, subscribing really does help us keep going, and we have a lot more to say about Invincible and the ideas hiding inside it. For now though, rest. Let these thoughts settle wherever they need to settle. And if you dream tonight, dream of something you might become, not what anyone told you to be, something you chose for yourself. Good night.